Well, in our prophetic genre course, we've now arrived at our session in regards to synthesis. Synthesis. Now, synthesis is something I've been mentioning in class. Hopefully it's been mentioned to you. And what synthesis is, if you look at the definition, what this step in the process is, this is the process of bringing everything together. That's the idea of synthesis, bringing everything together. So this step in the exegetical process, it focuses you, the preacher, on the task of bringing all the things that you've learned, bringing them all together, bringing everything together, all the exegetical data, everything that you've been learning. So at the beginning of the course, we talked about narrative analysis, poetical analysis, bringing in that aspect of what you've learned before in previous courses, because in prophetic genre, usually the passage that you're going to study and going to preach is going to be in narrative format or poetical format. So you start with narrative and poetical analysis, and you go through all those steps. And that includes textual observations. That would include looking at the history and culture. No matter which one you're going to look at, or a combination of the both, in terms of narrative and poetry, you're going to have to deal with those other things that we've learned in the past. So you've done those, and then we went to sermon analysis, because sometimes when the prophet preaches, or when he's speaking, he's actually preaching a sermon. And so it's a developmental thing in which he has a subject matter, he has a contextual matter, and he has the details in terms of how does he develop all that. So it's a what, why, how, right? Remember that? So you have narrative analysis, poetical analysis, sermon analysis, and then the foretelling analysis, where sometimes what the prophet is speaking about is something that's going to happen in the future, right? Something that's going to take place years beyond that time span. And so you have to note all those. Well, at this point in the process, you've been doing these things isolated from each other. And then it all led up to kind of a structural analysis to see the overall structure of the passage. But now you got to bring all the details together. You got to bring them all together. You got to be able to look at them all at the same time. And really, this is something you want to do before you answer the three questions. You may have an idea of what the answers to the three questions are: the what, the why, and the how, the primary matters. But it's here where you finalize that. It is here where you really begin to say, yeah, that's the foundation, or the primary functional matters of the passage. By doing synthesis, you're bringing all the exegetical data that you've gathered, and you're bringing it into one place. And so the best way, I think, for me to help you see this is there's not like a procedure. You've already done the procedures. You've walked through all the steps. It's just bringing it together is the whole thing. The best way for me to explain this to you is to just give you a visual perspective of it, to kind of give you a visual understanding of it, a visual example. And the passage that I've been using is the Isaiah 6 passage. We've been looking at Isaiah 6 for every single session, every single exegetical process, exegetical step. And so I want to show you that. So on the screen, you're going to see some images. And these images come from Isaiah chapter 6. And this is the way I've examined the passage. And so what you see me doing, there's no science to this. There's no like one way to do this. You're going to see that I've put boxes around certain items, certain words. I've made marginal notes to the side. I have arrows pointing to certain boxes. I've highlighted words with different colors. And it may not even look to you like I cannot even understand what I'm seeing on the page. But the point is, you don't need to understand what's on the page. I have to understand what's on the page. When you work on your passage, what you're doing is you're going back to those previous assignments. And you've been visually putting it on paper. Now you want to go through the passage one more time, word by word, phrase by phrase. You want to walk through the passage, so to speak. You want to go in the order in which it appears. And go back to what you've already learned. Go back to what you've already studied and bring it all together on one piece of paper, or 3 pages since I've had it printed that way. You want to be able to see the whole and all the details that are in there. So that's what I've done here. I've highlighted verbs, marked those. Any repeated words that I could find, anything that was significant. You can see that I have in there the flow of the narrative genre, because the narrative genre drives the whole thing. So like verse 1, there's the opening situation. We start with that, and then we're going to go down to the problem. That's going to be in there as well. And then we're going to have the resolution to the problem. So you have all these narrative markers that come from the narrative analysis. You can see those in there. And all the little details as well on the page. And so these are my personal notes. These are my exegetical notes. I would never show these to my congregation because they're not going to understand this. But this is how my brain thinks. And what you have to do is not like copy me. That's not the point of this. You arrive at your own system that works for you. But what I'm trying to help you see is that if you do this in a visual format, and if you've been doing that already, then when you get to this stage, it'll be easy for you to look at the passage, visibly see it on the piece of paper, and make these markings for yourself, whatever works for you, whatever color you want to use, whatever, if you want to underline or put a box or a circle, it doesn't matter. But these are a way of which what you're doing is you're trying to bring it all together, every step in the process, and bring it together to bear at the same time and in the same location. Because by doing that, your brain is you're helping your brain focus on the whole flow of the passage, on all the details that you don't want to forget, on all the important matters that are in the passage. You don't want to see these as isolated exegetical steps. You want to bring it all together, and you want to do this so that you can see the whole as well as the details within the whole. It's kind of like, you go to a coffee shop or you go to a Starbucks and you look and you see all the different cakes and the pies and they're very tasty, aren't they? They look very tasty. And you may not have the money to buy one, a piece. And probably you would never buy the whole pie. Mas mahal, right? Too expensive. However, you may get a piece of the pie. One piece of that. And when you're looking at the whole thing, or at least what's left of it, right? And you see them carve out the piece and put it on a plate for you. Well, you're seeing the whole, but you're seeing the details. It's everything. And so think of it that way. What you're producing here is a way to see the whole story, the whole picture. That will help you with answering those 3 questions finally, and coming to terms with, this is the what, the why, and the how. But it will also help you in being able to see all the details that surround it. If you look at down below in the Isaiah passage, later on in the latter half of the chapter, you see where the poetry shows up. And you see that I've made little lines there to the left of the wording, and I have an S and a D, some D's there, and what that is that's going back to poetry analysis, and what I'm showing is that means synonymous or developmental, and you can see that continues on the 3rd page, where there's basically still more developmental, and there's even one contrasting one that I noted. So again, I'm bringing in as much as I can to bear upon what I've learned. On the 2nd page, just going back to the 2nd page, you can see that at the bottom of the page, I bring in my sermon analysis information. And the sermon analysis is the latter part of verse 9 all the way through verse 10. And I don't know if you remember, we went through that, talked about that in class, but I have my what, my why, and my how. And it may be cut off there, but they have no insight and no conviction. And I didn't put the verse references there, but those are the ideas that are in that short little sermon, which the sermon is not the main thing. Again, it's just part of the passage. It's part of Isaiah 6, not the whole thing, but I make a note of that. And then on the final page, I'm talking about foretelling. There's some foretelling aspects in there, and if you look at the very top, this is when it talks about until the cities lie waste without inhabitants, that's a near future event. It's in the Old Testament time frame that this happens. So it's around 740 BC that this is told to Isaiah, that he has to start preaching this and saying these words and make this known. That would happen about 130 years later, in 605, 597, and 586, when Nebuchadnezzar would come into Judah and take them away. And so, again, I'm noting the prophetic elements, the foretelling elements. I'm noting the sermon elements, and I'm noting the textual observations. I've put SW above some of those words. Those would be words that I would need to look at for significant words. You can write that out. I haven't done that on this document, but you can write out what you find for those. So again, it's everything coming together is the point here. So you want to be aware of that. This is something you want to begin to do. And the more you do this for your passages, the easier it will be to do it more in your head. You won't have to write out everything. You don't need to type it out so it's really nice and neat. You're just trying to bring it all together and put it in a format which you can understand. And again, I would never don't show this to anybody unless you're wanting them to look at what you've done. But this is not your sermon. This kind of document is not your sermon. This is just bringing your exegetical data together for the purposes of understanding it as a whole and understanding the details, because you also, how are you going to go through this? It helps you prepare yourself for that sermon content document, what you're going to write, what you're going to put together. It's that intermediate step. And here's where you really begin to interpret everything and see where all the connections are. So hopefully this has been helpful to you. In class, we're going to talk about this more, do some more practice with it, maybe do some other passages with it, or whatever your professor would love to do in helping you bring it all together. So again, have a good week in your studies, and as you work on your synthesis for your passage, and as you prepare for working on the primary matters and your sermon content document for your prophetic passage. Take care, and God bless.